Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Run the Gauntlet, the free monthly writing program where brave authors send me the opening scenes of their works in progress. And once a month, I pick one lucky writer or one crazy writer, however you choose to look at it, to take those opening scenes and apply a developmental edit, which I then post publicly. And every month we work with completely different genres of fiction or memoir. We look at completely different issues. We have great conversations around some of the issues raised. And I'm particularly excited by this month's submission, Destiny of the Soul. This is actually from a writer of mine that I first met maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and we had a really brief interaction, but then it's been quite some time since we communicated, and she came to me and submitted her work for this program, and it was a real blast from the past, and she has been working on this story since then. So as you will see, it is really polished. It's quite refined. She's definitely a really talented writer. But as a developmental editor, this is the perfect kind of project for me to sink my teeth into because it keeps me on my toes. So the opportunities that we're going to be identifying today for further development, they're not the easy to recognize glaring problems or low-hanging fruit. We're really going to have to strategically pull apart the opening scene to look at how we can maximize the drama of that opening scene. It's high stakes. There's a lot happens. It's extremely evocative and descriptive, and we're going to see how we can take an already strong opening scene and make it that much better. This month's project is a work of historical fiction, dual timeline. The opening scene is what we'll be focusing on today, and that is the scene that's set in the historical timeline of the story. So we're not going to be looking at the modern timeline today. The writer that has been kind enough to share her work with us, she has a technical writing background, and you can see when you're reading her work that she's definitely experienced, but her main concern is trusting her voice, and I think that a lot of technical writers struggle with that. They as soon as they have to get creative, as soon as they have to get descriptive, as soon as they have to put themselves out there in terms of thinking of analogies and all of the kinds of creative artistic sides of writing, suddenly that can be really scary because it could be like, do I sound ridiculous? Do I sound naive or juvenile with the words that she used? I think that you'll agree that her writing definitely isn't juvenile, but those are really, really common fears that writers have, especially a lot of the writers that I work with that do have writing backgrounds, but they've come from a totally different format or kind of writing. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into it. If you haven't watched this program before, what I tend to do is I read a section of the story and then we go back and we look at these very mysterious comment boxes here where I then apply some feedback based on what we've read so far. So, Destiny of the Soul, prologue. Ka'ala walked along the rocky trail she'd come to know so well. It led her to the place she felt most safe, yet away from the people she loved most. She had failed in so many ways. Mostly she had failed her people. She tried telling her clan what she had learned. Her people believed Wahan instead. They remembered the old man as he used to be before he had the infant killed. The fools. Could they not see how Wahan misled them? She hated Wahan, hated what he had done to her mother, to the baby, and to herself, and she hated the hunters even more, especially Meti, for standing behind Wahan. Yes, her people were fools, but she could not blame her clan for their failures. They had not seen what she had seen, not heard or experienced what she had. Regardless, it was too dangerous to leave her secret cave and go back home until she could figure out a way to make her people and her mother understand. So that's pretty intriguing. I'm sure you will agree, little opener that we have there. Now, if I just bring up the comments that I have, the first one is a really, really minor one, but I'm going to bring it up because I see this in pretty much every manuscript that crosses my desk. And I bring this up actually because it's one of those things that agents and publishers look for as a little bit of a rookie mistake or a little bit of a red flag that you're not a totally experienced writer. But these little indents here, which we have for every new line, you do not need them at the beginning of a new chapter or the beginning of a new scene. They're only there to create a visual demarcation point between this new line and the line above it. But in a new chapter, we have no line above it, and so we don't need any indent. Again, I, as a developmental editor, don't tend to comment on formatting issues, but it is one of those little red flags that agents and publishers and readers in general can sometimes look out for. The next point that I have here is that look at, I find that when you read work aloud, you can comprehend a lot of the details more easily because you're absorbing the information more slowly. When readers are going to be reading this as a book, they're going to probably be reading it far more quickly, and so their ability to take in all of those details is going to be lessened. And if we note the amount of information we have just in this one paragraph, it's that Ka'ala has learned a secret that she tried to expose. Her people have sided with a man called Wahan. That person has changed into a different version of himself. He had an infant killed. Wahan has also done something to her mother, and there are a group of hunters that are also potentially dangerous to her. Now, that is a lot of information for one paragraph, and it could all be relevant, and individually those points are really intriguing. But the question that you have to ask yourself in opening scenes is, what does the reader need to know? Now, I would argue, based on the scene that we're going to see follow from that point, the reader really only needs to know three things at this point of the story. One, Ka'ala is on the run. Two, she tried to expose a deadly secret. And three, her village and her people have turned against her. But we don't need specific details to understand that. We can still keep it pretty big picture at this point. And we also don't need to cover all of that in a single paragraph. We could cover that across 1 page or even 2 pages. Why do we need to know those three things? Well, contextually, they're the most important three things for us to know. She's in danger. That's really important in terms of context. She tried to expose a deadly secret. I think that's important because it tells her that she's a good, honest person who's tried to do the right thing, which instantly makes us empathize with her more. And if we empathize with her more, we're more invested in finding out what happens to her next. And her village has turned against her, which explains why she has nowhere to run and she's in hiding. So you can see how those big picture elements are potentially enough for the story right now. And as soon as we start feeding more and more detail in, we're falling into that trap of just wanting to set up as much of the story as possible for the reader. But the reader at this point doesn't necessarily want detail. They just want a character that they can care about and an initial plot premise that seems compelling and engaging in some way. So moving on to the next section. No one except Hannah knew how to find her hiding place, and Hannah would never lead Wahan to her. She felt safe walking along the trail where so much had happened that had changed her life, changed her. She leaned against the sandstone bluff abutting the bison trail and closed her eyes, concentrating on the sounds of the nighttime birds calling to their mates. It was breeding season, and the mockingbirds' frantic imitations of all their feathered rivals made Ka'ala smile. Herons courted one another along the riverbed below, cackling and squawking, and then, as if of a single mind, they rose from the wetland and began a raucous caterwauling. Whomp, whomp. The sound of heron wings reverberated off the sandstone bluff as they took flight and relocated down the river. What scared you, graceful herons? Is there a long-toothed cat prowling around and hunting tonight? So I only had one comment for this section that I wanted to pause and touch on, but when you read these words, what time of day are you kind of picturing, with all of these graceful birds in the wetland and flying off, and all of this life kind of happening? It's energetic. There's lots going on. It's a beautiful visual scene, right? So one thing that you have to watch out for is that technically all of this description is accurate. Ka'ala could be experiencing all of these sounds and their calls and knowing that the herons are courting each other in the riverbed below. But the visual impression it gave me, at least, is that this is like a daytime scene or an afternoon scene. I'm kind of picturing like late sunset, maybe, when all of these animals are most active. And in fact, what this whole scene, something that proves to be very important later on, is very much based in pitch black dark. There is no moon, there is no light. She can barely see anything around her. And given the tension in this scene and the action to come, that dark, thick, suffocating black that has, effectively blinded her is such a powerful tool to use in order to build tension, in order to foreshadow tension, trouble to come or danger to come. And while this description is really, really beautiful, and I love the idea of the birds, the sounds of their wings reverberating off the sandstone and all of the rest of it, even though she hasn't said, I looked at the golden light of the sunset on the sandstone, we can still create an impression that actually is inaccurate. So while describing this landscape, at least Ka'ala's experience of the landscape through sound, we've actually created a very visual description of the landscape, which isn't totally accurate because it's actually really dark. And that darkness is going to prove really important to the context of the scene and what follows. So that's just something to think about when you're working through your description. You can, in bringing a setting to life, you can actually create an incorrect impression without even intending to do so. And we shall continue. The noisy mockingbird suddenly fell silent. Ka'ala wondered if she should start back to the safety of her cave in case Longtooth had been unsuccessful hunting herons and was searching for easier prey, her. From somewhere above, an owl softly hooted, breaking the silence and lulling Ka'ala back into a sense of well-being. You always made me feel safe whenever you were around me, dear friend, she reflected, as she looked for the owl and its perch on the rocky escarpment above her and saw only darkness. She closed her eyes, breathing in the pungent aroma of sage, and waited for the night sounds to return to normal. Only the incessant hoo-hoo of owl broke the silence, and the hoots grew louder and louder. Why are you screaming? Is Longtooth coming for me? Ka'ala got to her feet and looked over the rocky ledge's rim into the river valley beneath her. With no moon to light the scene, she saw nothing. Owl's hooting turned into frantic, ear-piercing screeches, and she felt the large bird of prey's feathers brush her face as it swooped past her. What is it? She hissed into the darkness as she crouched nearer to the rock wall. Owl flew to a perch somewhere farther away and continued screeching its warning cries. Owl is distancing himself so the attention will be drawn away from me, she thought. Why? What is out there? Ooh, lots of tension building here. What is out there? You will soon find out. So before we get to that point, let's look at some of the comments we have here. One thing I would say, you always make me feel safe when you're around me, dear friend. Ka'ala back into a sense of well-being. To me, this language is quite modern. It could even be kind of classical turn of the century language in some ways as well. I'm not entirely sure when this scene is based. I think that Ka'ala is a Native American Indian. I believe that the character that is set in the present timeline is an archaeologist, and that is the kind of connection between them. So I'm thinking that Ka'ala's scenes are set pretty far back in history. And I think that there is room to reflect that more, not only in her direct interior monologue sections like this, or her direct dialogue where we hear her spoken word, but also just in the tone of the narrative itself should represent her perspective. And to me, I feel that you could simplify the language, and potentially make that a truer representation of how Kaala would see the world and how Kaala would describe the world. I almost don't want to say that because I think that, you know, the writing is really eloquent and that's a wonderful thing. But I'm thinking that that style of writing is going to come out in the timeline that we have in the present plot, or the character who is set in the present day or the modern time period. And so by simplifying this language, we'll create even more distinction and more authenticity in those two voices when we do reach the modern time frame. Aside from the sophistication of the language and that kind of modern style, also look at just some of the words that we're using and the tone that they create. So lulling sense of well-being, dear friend, graceful herons. Tone is a powerful tool, and there is a difference between, say, following a character who is taking a peaceful, contemplative walk and then just happens to fall upon an accident of some sort, let's say, and we have, like, you know, tension and conflict in the scene, but it kind of, we weren't expecting it. Versus in this scene, we have a character who is a young woman who has lost everything that she cares about, her home, her ability to survive in this wild landscape. You know, she's being actively hunted by the people that she once considered family. So for me, this woman is bereft, she is banished, she's on the run, and you know, if she's being actively hunted by her own people, she's probably done something really big and really serious. And even if she has a lot of conviction in what she's done and she thinks she's done the right thing, it's going to carry a certain level of weight, potentially guilt and shame, potentially elements of regret, because we can believe in something that we've done and still question it. And so I think that by having a more flowery tone and style, while I like it in isolation as a tone and style, to me, potentially it's undermining the amount of tension we could be developing in these scenes, especially with the action that's about to follow. Really minor point, but would she risk speaking aloud if she thinks that she's being hunted by a predator, like a mountain lion? You know, here she says, "Why are you screaming? Is Longtooth coming for me?" That, to me, I think that if you're a person who lives in nature and is used to being followed by predators like that, you're probably going to be really quiet. Maybe I'm being too literal, but that's just as someone who goes hiking quite a lot, especially in the US. The few times I felt I was being stalked by something, I was extremely quiet. Unless, of course, I was trying to jingle bells and scare off a bear, but that's a slightly different kind of situation. The other point that I have here is just to watch interior dialogue. Or interior monologue. This is this section here, these examples here, where we have a stream of consciousness, the character's direct thoughts. It's something that we love to fall back on as writers, and some writers like using it more than others, and there's no set rule around these things, like you can only use it this much or not this much. Like all tools, it's there for you to be used, but I think of it as more of a garnish rather than a primary ingredient in the writing. Sorry, I think that it's something to be used in, you know, sparsely and with impact and with real strategy. And ultimately, if you can, you know, cover this through your regular narrative and the reader still gets exactly the same impression of what's happening and what the character's thinking, because we're already in her point of view. So if the narrative states that, you know, she's put A and B together and come up with C, we already know that that's her idea, not someone else's idea. So, you know, for example, we can have here, Al is distancing himself, so the attention will be drawn away from me, she thought. Why? What is out there? When we use that kind of interior dialogue, it feels a bit obvious, doesn't it? It's like we're over-explaining the character's thoughts. And also, when you think about it, people don't really think in complete sentences. You think in impressions, you think in feelings, you have little flashes of thought, but we don't talk to ourselves internally in long sentences like that. So there's a slight inauthenticity about it. And ultimately, as I said, you can kind of just cover it in the regular narrative just as easily. So I've got an example here, which is rough. But Owl flew to a perch somewhere farther away and continued screeching its warning cries. The bird was distancing himself to draw the attention away from her. But why? What was out there? So I haven't had to turn that into a stream of consciousness thought where she's talking to herself. You still very much get the impression that in that narrative we're covering her ideas and her insights, but we haven't had to go through the distraction and added step of turning it into this kind of internal speech that she's giving herself, or this internal dialogue that she's having with herself. Also note that we haven't got to this yet, but if we lose the internal dialogue here and use it more as a garnish, then when we have it, in lines like here down below, that will carry more impact as opposed to just kind of feeling like more of the same. So let's move on to, I think, the final section. She heard something moving in the murky darkness on the trail behind her. Instinctively, she reached for her knife, but the sheath hanging on her leather belt was empty. She had left her knife in the cave. Who was the fool now? You are not Longtooth, she whispered. He knows better than to make so much noise if he wants to eat. Are you Bear? You are big and do not care how much noise you make, do you? But there are no bears around here. I would have seen their tracks. Who are you? Why are you hunting me? Legs trembling and heart pounding against her chest, Ka'ala pushed herself to her feet and ran away from the troubling noises and movements. She glanced over her shoulder to catch a glimpse of her assailant. She saw nothing in the darkness, but thought she heard heaving breathing. Was it her own? Running blindly on the rocky trail proved challenging with no light guiding her, but she dare not stop. Placing her hand on the rocky wall next to her steadied her gait, allowing her to run faster. She heard voices, men's voices. Spinning toward the sound, Ka'ala saw Meti emerging from the night's shadowy depths. Behind him trailed 6 of the clan's best hunters. All had their spears raised as if to strike Ka'ala. Meti, how did you find me? Ka'ala bolted toward her cave with a renewed energy. Spears still raised, the men running behind her were getting closer. Stop, Ka'ala, you could not outrun us, Meti yelled. He had loved her once, but no more. He could not be trusted. She had to get away, had to make it to her secret cave if she wanted to live. I find good places to stop, don't I? So the antagonist has been revealed. It is not a mountain lion or a cougar. It is not a bear. It is her own people who have come for her. A very dramatic and, I would say, compelling premise to open the book with. So really minor note, but as I mentioned earlier, I just see a little bit of inauthenticity here in, having these long spoken sentences out loud when you think you're being stalked by a predator. I know that when I've been in that situation, I have been so quiet that I've stopped breathing and had to remember to breathe. I'm so terrified. So maybe she's a stronger, braver person than I am, but I also think if you have sections in your narrative where the character is talking to themselves in long sentences and not only speaking to themselves externally as actual out loud spoken word, but also following that up with internal thoughts too, you're probably using too much of a good thing, and it's time to allow the narrative itself to carry a little bit more of the weight of those ideas and those insights, because all of these narrative modes, whether they be internal monologue, dialogue, whatever, if they're overused, they get distracting, they feel labored, and we can start telling instead of, showing. So it's something to watch out for. On to the next comment. Obviously, as we see here, the men are revealed to her and she sees Meti emerging from the night's shadowy depths. depths. He used to be her lover, clearly. I think there's a reference there as well. So he plays a really pivotal role in this scene. But if you think about the initial introduction, where we had all these different details of Wahan and her mother and a murdered infant, we had very little mention of Mehdi at all. Given that he plays a really pivotal role in this scene, he has a bigger contextual link to the action that's happening here. So I would be looking at focusing on him more earlier in this scene, because that investment will have a greater return given the action that actually follows. If we can drop a few subtle hints about him earlier, then potentially the appearance of him now will carry a greater sense of shock or betrayal or whatever it is that we want to engender in the reader. The next point I had here also is obviously Ka'ala is, desperately trying to get back to her cave. If she could make it there, these men can't find her and she's safe. If she knows that she's being hunted, or she knows she's a target, we established that at the beginning of the scene, and the cave offers her so much protection, I would just show that there, like a really quick hint that there is a reason why she has left the cave. For example, going to fill her water jug, and she's waited until it's the dark of night because that's the safest time for her to sneak around. And she's kind of gone down there to fill up her water jug and scramble back up to the cave. And she's risked her life in doing that for a good reason, as opposed to the current description, which seems to kind of suggest that she's gone down to this lovely plateau to, take in the night air and hang out with some animal friends and, take in the view, which, if she is at that level of risk and there are all these predators prowling around and hunters prowling around, it's harder to empathize with her choice to do that just because she kind of felt like it. So by showing that she had a good reason for leaving the cave in the first place, we empathize more with the fact that despite her best efforts, she's been caught out and she has to try and get back there as quickly as possible. And now we reach the final section. There was only one chance of evading the hunters. She had to get past the rock facades outcropping ahead of her before the men were close enough to see her leave the path. She turned to see how close the hunters were when her sandal caught beneath a protruding tree root. Ka'ala plummeted to the ground face first. Her head slammed onto a boulder, dazing her. She touched her head, feeling a lump made warm and sticky with her blood. I'm not sure that you would have a lump that quickly. Really minor point that I thought I would raise. She had to keep going. She had to reach the safety of her cave. She attempted to stand, but her right leg would not respond. An unbearable pain shot through her, pulsing up her back. She looked at her twisted leg and saw glistening bone branching out from an open wound, her blood visible on the ground beneath it. She cried out in agony and despair. Mehdi and the hunters were upon her before the wail fully escaped her throat. She heard Mehdi calling to her, but his voice grew fainter as if he were moving away from her. Will it be as promised? If death closes my eyes in this world, will I wake up in the other world? Everything went dark and she could no longer hear Mehdi calling her name. End scene. Wow, powerful stuff, huh? I don't know if you're as squeamish as I am, but I find that kind of description really affecting in a good way, and I think it's been really well done. I do have some ideas on how we can develop it even further. So, as I said here, she looked at her twisted leg and saw glistening bone branching out from an open wound. Oh my God, my stomach is literally twisting even as I read that. So as I've said in my comment, I love the power of this devastating moment. She's done for. There's no getting out of this. And we realize that in a really impactful, punch to the gut. What I would say is, just from a kind of authenticity perspective, and this is something that you could probably argue either way, but it feels like a really extreme injury for a relatively minor accident, tripping over something and then twisting and breaking your leg to the point where the bone is protruding out of your thigh. Absolutely possible. I'm sure that it's happened to people, but in fiction, it's like readers are already expecting us to twist things to serve the plot. So we don't want to give them room to think that we've, dramatized something that would actually have a really, really low chance of happening. So I think that you can have this really horrible injury, but you can just add some supporting factors that make it a little bit more consistent with what actually happens. So, for example, if it's a rocky escarpment, we might show that a rock partially comes loose and crushes her leg in quite a serious way as she's kind of trying to climb up it. And for bonus points, at the beginning of the scene, we might show her coming down this escarpment with her water jug, and we might show that some of these rocks are a little bit unstable and she almost slips. And it's a tiny throwaway detail that the reader would never even notice or think about as they're reading that action and reading that scene, but it just sets up that and foreshadows that little bit of potential for this really serious accident that happens later. And it's an accident that's really important because it changes the context of everything that happens. It ends her escape. It ends her chance of avoiding these people and remaining free. So it's a big pivotal moment, and we want it to feel as authentic as possible, or as believable as possible. Now here, Maddie and the hunters were upon her before the whale fully escaped her throat. They were upon her. To me, I actually read this as almost like a pack of dogs upon her with their spears raised. And the second time I read it and the third time I read it, I actually realized that potentially, as Maddie is calling her name and growing fainter and fainter, potentially they're trying to help her. So we could just clarify the description and blocking there a little bit, so that we know, whether they're there to help her or whether she's effectively been murdered by her own people, or if her leg injury is so bad that she's quite literally died from blood loss in the space of like 5 seconds. It's a little hard to know for sure, but I feel like a little bit of tweaking could just solidify that bit of action. Again, it's kind of important contextually to understand who's responsible for her death. The other thing I would say, I think this is an example of where we have internal dialogue that's really effective, actually, because it really pops out at you, and it's a really important line. Will it be as promised? If death closes my eyes in this world, will I wake up in the other world? So she's part of a prophecy, and this is where we're kind of setting up the whole dual timeline, time travel, aspect of the story. So it's a pivotal line, and by putting it in italics and making it her own spoken thought, internal thought, we're giving it the attention and space and distraction that it deserves, but in a good way. One thing I would say is that with all of this action that's happening, and she's bleeding out and the men are upon her and all this stuff is kind of happening, this is quite an important idea in the story, that she's part of some kind of prophecy or that she's special in some way. And again, I think this is the kind of detail potentially that you might want to hint at earlier in the scene, so that when it comes up here, it feels like a consistent extension of us learning about who she is and what's happened to her and her story, as opposed to it kind of just popping up out of the blue a little bit. And we certainly understand the meaning of it and we take it in, but I think like just one little hint or a couple of little details earlier on that suggests that she is different or that she is part of some greater plan, without being really overt and obvious and info dumping and over explaining, but a tiny little hint of some sort. Could be clutching an amulet of some sort that's said to have secret powers or whatever. That's a bad example, but you get the idea. We can just foreshadow this a little bit so that it feels as kind of consistent and cohesive as possible. That covers everything that we have for this scene. I've totally forgotten to give you guys the code word for this month. I usually bury it midway through the assessment. The code word is long tooth. Now, if you're thinking about submitting your own opening scenes for this Run the Gauntlet program, mention that code word in your application form and it will give you bonus points and a little bit of edge, because it's important to me that obviously I get lots of great manuscripts every month, but I'm trying to build a community, and I love to think that the writers who submit their manuscripts into this program are the same writers that are actually watching the program and benefiting from the insights that we all share together. So Longtooth is the code word for next month's application round. So applications for the next Run the Gauntlet close on February 15. Did you catch the code word? Well, if you've made it this far, you probably did, because I said it all of 5 seconds ago. See some links below. You'll find the links to apply if you have a story that you would, or opening scenes that you would like for me to assess. The application form is like 3 questions. It's super quick. So fill that in, send me a file, and hopefully I get to read your work. I've also got a Run the Gauntlet edit offer below if you're interested in investing in a professional edit of your opening scenes, and you don't want to submit your work for public sharing. That is also totally understandable. So check out that link too. I want to really quickly also thank my friend Derek Murphy for being really supportive of this program. He's offered me some great advice. So he is an incredible kind of indie guerrilla marketing expert, and he really does offer really fantastic courses and things. If you're in that stage of publishing where you need support, you need to know, how do I get a reading list? How do I get my work out there? How do I get people to read my stuff and find the right people for the right readership from my work? He is fantastic. I don't get any, affiliate payments or anything for saying this. I'm just a real believer in his work, and I recommend a lot of my clients to him. So I'm going to include a link to his stuff as well, in case you're past the developmental stage and you're at the publishing stage. Then he has some amazing resources to check out. And really, the final thing that I want to say is thank you so much to the writer of this work. I hope that it is clear in my analysis of this, that I see so much fantastic potential for this scene, but also that I'm in awe of the skill and talent of her in terms of crafting really beautiful narrative, in terms of crafting, really compelling, high tension, high conflict, high empathy scenes where we're really on the side of the character who's in trouble. We're really reading on to find out what happens next. Great writers make that seem so effortless, but it actually takes so much skill and effort and editing and time, as many of you fellow writers know. And handing that up on a silver platter to be deconstructed by myself in this public forum, I think takes a good dose of courage and open-mindedness and commitment to the story, which I think is always, they're wonderful attributes to have as a writer. So thank you to her, and to everyone else who is potentially interested in applying, apply. I would love to see your writing. Send it through. What have you got to lose? And we will see what next month's project brings. Hopefully something totally new and fresh again. I'm also going to put up some cards here for previous Run the Gauntlet episodes that I've done, which you might want to watch and check out, see what we've covered before. Maybe your story will bring something totally new to the conversation. But thank you so much for watching. Keep up the fantastic writing, and until I next see you, keep running that gauntlet. All right, guys, have a good one. Bye.